The delegate's voice carried across the entire hall when he asked the question. It was not a quiet question. It was the kind of question someone asks when they already know the answer and want everyone else to know they know it. Which of the human attendees present have received formal combat training? Holding a small glass of something warm that smelled like pine and copper. There were 9 of us in the human delegation. 8 diplomats. 1 specialist, me. I was the specialist. The hall was enormous. The ceiling rose so high above us that the upper edge of it disappeared into a faint blue mist. Around us stood delegates from 41 different species, all gathered for the opening ceremony of the Galactic Academy's annual diplomatic summit. It was supposed to be a celebration. The kind of event where everyone shakes hands or touches tentacles or does whatever their species does to say welcome, we are glad you exist. And then Delegate Vorshan, of the Keth Dominion, asked his question into a room full of people who had been laughing a moment before. The laughter stopped. I looked at him across the room. He was tall, the way the Keth always were. With 4 upper limbs and a chest built like 2 boulders stacked on each other. He had small orange eyes that caught the light from above and threw it back like coins. He was smiling, not warmly. I set my glass down on the tray of a passing server. Our delegation lead, a man named Colin Marsh, shifted slightly beside me. Colin was a career diplomat, excellent at his job, calm under pressure, and absolutely the wrong person to answer a question like that. He was not trained, none of the 8 were. They were diplomats and economists and a cultural liaison named Priya, who collected pressed flowers and spoke 6 languages. Wonderful people, completely untrained. Every set of eyes in the hall turned toward me. Some of them had more eyes than I was used to. Some had fewer. All of them focused. I have, I said. My voice was not loud. I did not try to make it loud. I said it the way you might say the time if someone asked. Delegate Vorshin's smile did not change. He let his gaze travel over me the way someone looks at an object they are not sure they recognize. I was not tall. I was not broad. I was wearing a navy diplomatic blazer and flat shoes, and my hair was pinned back with a plain clip. I have been told, like someone who teaches school, I have never corrected that impression. One, he said, to the room rather than to me. He said it with a kind of satisfied patience, like a point being made. The human delegation has sent one trained individual. There was a soft sound through the crowd. Not quite laughter. Something lighter. Agreement, maybe. Or the relief of confirmation. I looked at him and said nothing. There is a skill to saying nothing. It is not silence born of having nothing to say. It is silence that sits in the room like a presence, that makes the other person suddenly aware that they may have stepped into something they cannot see the edges of yet. I had been practicing that skill since I was 19 years old, in a training facility outside of Reykjavik, where the temperature in winter never got above -12, and the instructors believed strongly that discomfort was a classroom. I did not smile. I did not frown. Colin leaned toward me, very slightly. "Lena," he murmured, using my name as a full sentence. "The way people do when they want you to remember where you are and who is watching." "I know," I said quietly. The ceremony moved on. Speeches were made. A counselor from the Yanari Federation said something long and flowery about the importance of shared understanding. A musical group from the Ocean Collective performed something that made the floor vibrate in a way I felt more in my teeth than my ears. Food was passed around, drinks were refreshed, and the entire time, I was aware of the eyes that came back to me, curious eyes, measuring eyes, eyes that did the arithmetic and found the answer too small to take seriously. on what to expect at the Academy. The senior analyst at the Department of Interstellar Relations, a woman named Grace Alderton, who had short gray hair and a habit of tapping her pen against her knee when she was deciding how much to tell you, had sat across from me in a windowless room in Brussels and given me the overview. The Galactic Academy, Grace said, believes itself to be the most sophisticated institution in the known galaxy. They have been cataloging species capabilities for 400 years. They have detailed files on military strength, technological development, biological durability, psychological profiles, everything. Do they have a file on us? I asked. Grace tapped her pen once against her knee. They have the beginning of one, she said. They are finding it difficult to complete. I asked her why. She looked at me for a moment and then said, because a great deal of our information is classified, and the classification levels we use are ones they do not have equivalent categories for. I thought about that. They don't know what we are hiding, I said. More importantly, Grace said, they don't know how much we are hiding. Or why. And that is making certain members of the Academy Council very uncomfortable. Is not to threaten anyone, not to boast, not to demonstrate anything that was not specifically requested. Your job is to be present, be pleasant, be diplomatic, and allow them to form their own conclusions. I had nodded, and asked one more question. And if they ask me directly? Grace had smiled for the first time in the entire meeting. It was a small smile, the kind that knows something. Answer honestly, she said. That tends to be more unsettling than evasion. I thought about that conversation later that night. In the quarters the Academy had assigned to our delegation. The rooms were generous. High ceilings, wide windows that looked out over a campus of towers and garden bridges, and long reflecting pools, lit from beneath in pale green. It was beautiful in the way of places built by people who have had a very long time and a great deal of resources, and no pressure to be practical. My room was on the 4th floor. I stood at the window and watched lights move slowly across the grounds below. Students, probably. The Academy ran an academic program alongside the diplomatic functions. Young members of member species learning galactic history, interspecies law, xenobiology. Thousands of them, from dozens of worlds. I wondered how many of them had been told about humans. I wondered what they had been told. I went to bed at my usual time and slept without difficulty, which is something I learned to do in environments that are not comfortable or safe or familiar, because sleep is a tool, and you do not throw away tools because the conditions are inconvenient. In the morning, there was a message waiting on the diplomatic terminal in our common room. It was addressed to the full delegation, but marked specifically for my attention. The Academy's Interspecies Assessment Division wished to schedule a meeting. Colin read it over my shoulder, and then looked at me in the way he had looked at me several times since we arrived, which was the look of a man who was not sure whether to be reassured or alarmed by my presence. I thought about it. Not long. No, I said. I think it is better if I go alone. He looked like he wanted to argue, and then something in the way I said it made him decide not to. Which is rarer in diplomats than you would think. He could read a room. He was reading me now, and whatever he was reading, it was telling him that this was not a situation that would be improved by adding more people to it. I always do, I said. I finished my coffee. It was not as good as the coffee at home, but it was hot, and it was present. And those were the two things that mattered most. I put on my blazer, checked that my identification badge was in place, and went to find out what the Interspecies Assessment Division of the Galactic Academy wanted from the one trained human in the building. I already suspected I knew. The corridor to their offices was on the far side of the main academic complex, which meant walking through the central atrium. The atrium was the kind of space that was meant to impress, and it did the job honestly. It was open all the way up through the building, dozens of floors, with walkways crossing at different heights, and plants trailing down from planters on each level. Light came in from above through a latticed ceiling and fell in long pale bars across the tiled floor. Students moved through it in groups and alone. They stopped talking when I passed. Or not all of them, but enough of them. Word moved faster in places like this than people like to admit, and the question Delegate Vorshan had asked the night before had clearly made its rounds. comfortable. I had learned that too, in the early years. The way you carry yourself in a room that is watching you tells everyone present whether you know you are being watched and whether it concerns you. I wanted them to know that I knew, and I wanted them to see that I was not concerned. Because I was not. I found the assessment division offices at the end of a quieter corridor with a high arched ceiling and doors made of something that looked like dark glass. With careful gestures and formal language, and showed me into a wide room with a long table and chairs scaled for several different body types. Seated at the table were 3 people. The first was a Yanari official named Coordinator Selen, with pale blue skin and very calm eyes. The second was a member of the Ocean Collective, which meant there were technically 7 of them at once in one body, all sharing sensory input and expressing through a single voice. The third was a human, or at least, a person sitting in the human-proportioned chair. He turned out to be a translation specialist from a species called the Marith, who were close enough to us biologically to use our furniture, but not close enough to be comfortable with direct eye contact. The coordinator said, "Thank you for coming, Specialist Vasquez. We would like to ask you some questions, if you are willing." I sat down in the remaining chair, folded my hands on the table, and said, "Of course." "We are preparing the Academy's formal species capability assessment for humanity," she said. "As part of that process, we have been reviewing your public military records." "I am aware," I said. "We have found," she said, choosing her words carefully, "some difficulty." I looked at her and waited. She glanced at the display again. "A significant portion of the relevant files are marked restricted." "Yes," I said. "We are not able to determine the scope of what is restricted," she said. I nodded gently. "Could you help us understand," she said, "what it is that we cannot see?" I'm afraid I cannot. The three of them were quiet. I kept my expression open and calm. Not apologetic. Simply honest. But I want to be helpful. I added, so I am happy to tell you what I can. You are welcome to ask. She set her display panel flat on the table. Delegate Vorshan asked last night which humans present were combat trained, she said. He did, I said. You were the only one who answered. Yes. That you are the only member of your delegation who is trained? I considered the question with the attention it deserved. For this delegation, I said yes. But he was listening with an intensity that showed in the way he held his shoulders. What level of training do you carry, Specialist Vasquez? Pen tapping against her knee, telling me to answer honestly. The standard level, I said, for someone who does what I do. The coordinator blinked. And what is it that you do? I smiled at her. It was a real smile. Warm, even. The room was very quiet after that. I thanked them for their time, stood up, and walked back through the long corridor with the arched ceiling and the dark glass doors, back through the atrium where the light fell in pale bars and the students watched me pass. Behind me, I was fairly certain, three very senior officials were sitting in a room with a display panel full of redacted files and the slowly forming understanding that the answer I had given them was entirely true and had told them absolutely nothing. That was, as Grace would have said, more unsettling than evasion. I found a good spot near the reflecting pool outside, sat on a bench in the morning light, and waited for whatever was coming next. I did not have to wait long. The first full day of the summit was just beginning. There were 14 more days ahead of us. I was in no hurry. I was very patient. That too was something I had learned. Outside the window of the assessment office, the campus of the Galactic Academy stretched out in every direction, beautiful and quiet, and unaware of the small thing that had just begun inside it. A question, a silence, a smile that gave nothing away. The humans sent one trained person. They were still deciding what that meant. The second morning at the academy started the way most second mornings do, in a place that is not home. The light came in at the wrong angle, the quiet had a different texture than the quiet I was used to, and for a moment, between sleeping and waking, I was very precisely aware of exactly how far I was from Earth. Then I got up, made coffee with the machine on the counter, and got to work. There was a joint session on interspecies trade corridors in the morning, a working lunch hosted by the Yanari Federation, and an afternoon forum on shared astronomical mapping protocols. Colin had the morning session, Priya had the lunch, I had the afternoon, which was technical enough to need a specialist present, and dull enough that no one else wanted to go. I did not mind dull. Dull was fine. Dull was often where the real information lived, tucked inside the margins of a boring agenda item that no one was paying close attention to because they were too busy watching the interesting things. I went to the afternoon forum with a tablet, a stylus, and a small thermos of the coffee I had made that morning, because the coffee at Academy events had not improved. The forum was held in a medium-sized chamber on the third floor of the research wing, with tiered seating and a display screen at the front, large enough to show full star charts. Most of them scientists and technical staff, rather than senior diplomats. They nodded at me when I sat down. I nodded back. The session ran for 2.5 hours. It was, as expected, technical and methodical, and not in any way exciting. I took notes. I asked 2 questions during the open discussion period. Both were good questions. The kind that make the person presenting feel that someone in the room was actually paying attention. Which they were. As people were gathering their things and the room was beginning to empty, a young woman came and sat in the seat beside me. She was from a species I recognized as Theron, with pale gray skin, long fingers, and eyes that were almost entirely dark iris with very little white. She looked young by any standard. She introduced herself as Sarah, and she said she was a second-year student in the Interspecies Security Studies program. She wanted to ask me about Earth. Not about trade corridors or mapping protocols or any of the official summit topics. She wanted to know about Earth. I told her I had time. We walked out into the corridor together and found a sitting area near a window that looked over the eastern garden, and she asked her questions with the careful enthusiasm of someone who had done a lot of reading and was not entirely sure how much of it was accurate. She asked about our history, about the long and complicated centuries before we reached space, about the wars, which she had read about in her coursework, and found both confusing and deeply fascinating, about how we had managed to survive them and still arrive at the galactic community as a species that wanted to participate rather than a species that had destroyed itself. I think it is because we got tired. She looked at me. Not permanently tired, I clarified. Not the kind of tired that gives up. The kind that stops and looks around and says, "All right, we have been doing this for a very long time, and the result is rubble and loss. And we are capable of more than rubble and loss." That kind of tired. Sarah thought about this for a moment. Other species in our records, she said slowly, who reached that same level of conflict. Most of them did not survive it. We know, I said. She looked out the window. What made you different? And we had enough people, at enough of the right moments, who decided that the next step forward was more interesting than the next step backward. She was quiet after that, in the way of someone filing something away carefully. Then she said, "The records about your military capacity, the ones the Academy has been trying to compile." I know about the records, I said. You do not need to be careful about mentioning them. She relaxed slightly. They are very incomplete, she said. They are, I agreed. The assessment division says that in 400 years of compiling interspecies military data, they have never encountered a classification system they could not eventually map. She paused. Aren't you worried, she asked, that the gaps make species nervous? That what they imagine might be worse than what is real? I looked at her for a moment. She was young, and she was smart, and she was asking me something that was genuinely worth thinking about. Tell me, I said, what do you imagine when you think of those gaps? She was honest. I appreciated that. Something large, she said. Something with a very long reach. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, that seems reasonable. She blinked at me. I said nothing more on the subject. I asked her about her program instead. About what she was studying. And she answered with the particular energy of someone who loves what they are learning and has not yet been worn down by the reality of doing it, professionally. It was a good conversation. I told her it was my pleasure, and I meant it. Walking back toward the delegation wing, I passed through the main atrium again. It was late afternoon now, and the light through the latticed ceiling was coming in at a lower angle, warmer, catching the tops of things and leaving the lower spaces in a soft shadow. Unburdened by the weight of the official schedule, I noticed three things as I crossed the atrium. The first was that the display boards mounted to the pillars throughout the space, which normally showed the Academy's schedule and announcements, had a small additional line at the bottom of each one. It was in several languages, and when I read the version in my own, it said, Interspecies Assessment Division, Update in Progress, Human Capability Review. The second was that a group of 4 Keth students near the central fountain went quiet when I walked by, and then started talking again in lower voices after I had passed. The third was that Delegate Vorshan was standing near the far exit of the atrium, speaking to 2 other Keth officials. And he looked up as I crossed the space. He watched me walk. I did not change my pace or my direction. I simply walked where I was going. When I reached the other side, I heard him say something to the others. I did not catch the words. I did not need to. Colin was waiting. He had an expression I recognized as controlled concern, which was the expression of a man who had received information he was not entirely prepared for, and was deciding how to arrange his feelings about it. The assessment division sent a second message, he said. I set my thermos on the counter and poured the last of the coffee into a mug. They have run a full cross-reference, he said. They pulled every public record, every treaty document, every academic paper, every piece of Earth-sourced material in the Academy's archives. They have compiled everything that was not redacted. And? Colin looked at his tablet, and then at me. They say the compiled picture is internally inconsistent. Meaning the parts they can see do not add up to a coherent picture by themselves. Some of what is visible suggests one level of capability. Other visible pieces suggest something significantly higher. Without the redacted sections, they cannot reconcile the gap. He paused. The lead assessor described it as trying to estimate the size of a building by looking through the keyhole. It was actually quite a good description. What did you tell them? I asked. Colin said, and then I came to talk to you. I finished my coffee and set the mug down. What do you want to know? He sat down at the low table near the window, and looked at me with the steady attention of someone who has decided to stop being careful about the question and just ask it. "Lena," he said, "how worried should I be about the way this is developing?" I sat across from him and thought about how to answer that honestly. "Worry is not the right word," I said. "What is happening is that the Academy is encountering a species they cannot fully measure, and that is producing uncertainty in people who are not comfortable with uncertainty." Vorshin's question last night was one of those ways. The records review is another. There will be more before the summit ends. "And we let them," I said. "And we do not fill in the blanks they are trying to fill." Colin was quiet for a moment. A very human question, actually. The instinct to smooth things over, to offer the clarifying detail, to be helpful in the most direct way available. A good instinct, mostly, not always. Because what they imagine, I said, is not necessarily worse than what is true. But what they imagine is theirs. It comes from them. It is built from our history, and what little they can see of our present, and it will generate more respect for what we are than anything I could say to them directly. Respect, Colin said. I said, are often the same distance apart. But he did not argue with it either. Colin was a good diplomat precisely because he could hold two things at once without needing to resolve them. He left to prepare for the next day's morning session. I stayed by the window for a while, watching the campus in the gathering dark. The display boards across the grounds were still showing their announcement, Human Capability Review. The phrase glowed softly in the night below. On the third morning, something changed in the texture of the place. It was subtle. The kind of change you notice, not because any one thing is different, but because several small things have shifted in the same direction at the same time. Students who had moved past me in groups the previous 2 days were now moving past me in smaller groups, or not moving past me at all, rerouting slightly to avoid the same corridor. The Keth officials who had stood near the central atrium in the evenings were not standing there anymore. At breakfast, a senior official from the Yanari Federation, named Counselor Devon, sat down across from me and made small talk about the mapping forum, and then asked, in what she clearly intended to be a casual way, whether I had received any further communication from the assessment division. Not yet this morning, I said pleasantly. She nodded and looked at her plate. But I expect I will, I added. She looked up at me. Something shifted in her expression, not alarm. More like the recognition that she was sitting across from someone who was following the same thread she was, and had been from the beginning. The review is attracting attention, she said quietly. I noticed, I said. Not all of it comfortable. That is understandable, I said. She looked at me for a moment in the particular way that people look at someone when they are trying to find the angle, the point of entry, The thing they can pull on. I looked back at her, pleasantly, and offered nothing. She was a diplomat too, and a good one. She recognized a closed door when she found one. "Will you be at the trade session this afternoon?" she asked. "I will be at the afternoon technical review," I said. "But I am sure my colleague Colin will represent us well in the trade session." She smiled. "I am sure he will." Which was more than she perhaps intended. The review was attracting attention. Not all of it comfortable. This meant that the internal conversations among Academy officials were already moving beyond the assessment division, already spreading, already becoming something that would require a response. I went back to my room after breakfast and sat at the small desk near the window. I opened a report I had been drafting since the first day, encrypted and routed through the Earth delegation's secure terminal, addressed to Grace Alderton in Brussels. I told her the timeline was moving, that the assessment process was accelerating, that the question had been asked and answered. in full view of 41 delegations, and the gap in the answer had been noticed, that the records review was ongoing and producing more uncertainty rather than less, that senior officials were beginning informal conversations that would probably become formal ones within the next few days. I told her I did not anticipate any security concerns. The environment was tense in the way of intellectual discomfort, not hostility. The Academy's protocols were strict and well enforced. There were no indicators of anything more than what it appeared to be, an institution that had encountered something it could not categorize, and was working very hard, in the way of all careful institutions, to find a category that fit. I told her it was going as expected. I sent the report. Then I closed the terminal, finished the last of my cold coffee, and went to find the Assessment Division offices again, because I had a feeling they would be sending for me soon, and it saved everyone time if I simply arrived first. I was right. Coordinator Selen was already standing near the entrance to the offices when I turned the corner of the corridor, and the look on her face when she saw me walking toward her was the look of a person who had just realized that the situation they thought they were managing had been, from the very beginning, managing itself. She did not deny it. Yes, she said. I thought it would be more efficient this way, I said. She held the door open, and I walked inside. The room had more people in it than the first time. The long table had 7 officials around it now, including Delegate Vorshon at the far end, who was watching me with those small orange eyes and an expression that had changed since the orientation. It was no longer satisfied. It was something else, something quieter. I sat in the nearest empty chair, folded my hands, and looked around the table at all of them. You have had time to review